So I think the easiest way to talk about what I mean, what I'm referring to by this term, is just to show you an example. But I need to just give you a little context. So I'm going to show you a couple of games that I made that I think sort of involve this technique of procedural metaphors. Starting with a game that I made for Global Game Jam 2017. Global Game Jam 2017 was in January and coincided with the presidential inauguration. So I wasn't able to attend all of the Global Game Jam because there were some protests here in Albany that I wanted to attend. This was Inaugurate Resistance. Some other folks from the game space went as well, so I think a lot of us were pressed for time during that game jam. So yeah, we spent some time at this, and there was quite a bit of a turnout here in Albany. So I spent some time at this, and then I got back to the site for Global Game Jam kind of in the last few hours. On the final day, and decided to make a game as quickly as I could. And, you know, I mean, I guess all these things just happened to be in my head, because this was the experience I had immediately prior. I made a game called Glass Ceiling, so I'm just going to show you that quickly. So this is a two-player competitive game. One player controls the orange square at the top there. There's a timer in the top right. You get a minute. It's just played in minute rounds. Orange square gets a score, and the pink square gets a score as well. The goal is to score the most points in order to win. But there are different scoring mechanisms. So orange, which I'm controlling at the moment, collects these green rectangles, gets 1 point every time that they collect one. And that's the only way of scoring points for orange. And every time that orange collects a green rectangle, this water level rises. And we're probably going to end the first round, and then I'll describe pink's scoring mechanism. This will be a blowout. So on the bottom, I'll show you pink. So pink can also score a point by collecting a green rectangle. Pink automatically gets a point for every second that they are out of the water, and loses a point for every second that they're in the water. And lastly, pink can score points by jumping to nudge up this glass partition. So orange can knock down the partition. Doesn't score any points, but it can impede the pink player, knock them down, so forth. So that's basically it for the game mechanics. Don't think there's anything else that I forgot. I think that's it. Interesting. It does seem that way, doesn't it? It's almost as if there's way more green rectangles towards the top, and they get very sparse the lower you get. Very observant, yes. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, that's right. They replenish very quickly, at least at the top. So yes, so that's Glass Ceiling. That's the game that I made for Global Game Jam 2017. So this is an example to me of a metaphorical game. Procedural metaphors may be an overly fancy way of saying it, but you know, not all games are representational. There are games that are, you know, arguably purely abstract. A game like Go, you know, is a game that's sort of at least going towards that end of the continuum. But many games are representational, and if you want to make a game that's about something, political or personal, or just anything that you want to make a game about, then I think that the concept of metaphor has a lot of application. So this is a style of game that I've made about various topics, and the basic commonalities are just that I like to try to make a game that is about something, represents something, or my understanding of something, my opinion of something, and I like to do it as much as possible through the rules and the way the interaction works as the main sort of representational elements, and keep the rest of the elements as light as possible. So while the visuals in this game are somewhat a matter of necessity in that it was created in a couple of hours, this is the style that I like to go for anyway in many cases. Keep the kind of audio-visual elements simple. That's not to say that they aren't representational, right? The title glass ceiling has connotations. The fact that one of the squares is orange has connotations, right? So it's not purely through rules, but all of these things have metaphorical aspects. So I'm going to talk about one other example of a game of mine that's a bit more of a personal application of these techniques, but I want to just kind of talk about other examples and some good writing if you're interested in the idea of metaphorical games. These are some suggested reading for you. So this was something that sort of kicked me off thinking about this, was this article back from 2009 by Ian Bogost about the proceduralist style. And I was already kind of making games like this, or I had this sort of style of thing that I knew I liked as a designer, but I wasn't really able to articulate like why I liked it or really what were the traits of this type of game. And this article articulates it very nicely. So the basic idea was Ian Bogost was talking about different kind of movements in art, whether it's like expressionism or this or that, and just talking about how, like, what are kind of art movements in games, and was identifying this thing that he coined the proceduralist style for. And there were a bunch of aspects to it, but the basic idea was games that are about something, they're expressing something that's personal to the creator, and they're doing it through kind of simple use of audiovisual assets, and basically the style that I described for Glass Ceiling. There are a lot of games that do this in different methods, and these are just some that I love. There are many, many examples. So, I'm by no means like pioneering this style of games. There are many people doing it much better than I do. Limb is a great example that I recommend checking out. You've got some of the games of Jason Rohrer, like Passage and Gravitation. The Marriage by Rod Humble is really like one of the first examples that I would say made a lot of game developers aware of this style of game making. But there are many, many examples that are worth checking out. There are also a lot of critiques of these style of games, and I think that those are important to read as well. So this is a blog by Daniel Cook, who's a game designer who I have immense respect for. And this article, Three False Constraints, and not only the article itself, but the kind of comments that it kicked off, again, around that same time period, 2009. This was a really interesting sort of critique. And one of the things that kind of stuck with me as like a pull quote from this was Daniel Cook saying, yeah, there are these types of games, but he was sort of questioning, to paraphrase, like how versatile they were, how far could you really take these types of techniques? Are they kind of maybe quite limited in terms of what they can express? And he said somewhere in this, the quote, "There's only so much you can express about life using XY coordinates," which is snappy, right? That's a snappy quote. In some ways, it's an incisive criticism. It's one that I happen to disagree with immensely. I think that metaphor is much more versatile than that. So I'd like to talk about why for a moment. So this is a book, I have it here. I have a couple of books that, again, are like sort of, I think, great reading for anybody interested in these topics. And this is one that's just, hugely influential in terms of the way people conceptualize metaphor. So the basic idea of this metaphors we live by roughly summarized by a non-academic like me, is that we often think of metaphor as a linguistic device. We think of it as something that's associated with like poetry or like these rhetorical flourishes or things. We think of it as like having a very specific context for where it's relevant. But actually, metaphor is not just a linguistic construct. It's a fundamental way in which we understand the world. Metaphor is very closely tied in with our conceptual systems and the way cognitively that we form new concepts, right? So metaphor, if we were roughly summarize like metaphor or related concepts like analogy, simile, what have you, the common thing I would argue that links them is it's a way of understanding one thing in terms of another thing, right? So often that could be like an abstract concept, right? So we learn lots of abstract concepts, and often the way we learn them and the way we describe them is by relating them to something that's more grounded in like our day-to-day experience, like our physical experience of the world, right? So when I'm happy, I'm up. When I'm sad, I'm down. These things are not reality. They're a metaphorical set of connotations that we have. So I'm really talking here about cognitive conceptual metaphors. And I think that those have immense relevance for all games. And I also think that they're a much more kind of versatile and flexible thing than Daniel Cook's sort of quote that I mentioned was sort of arguing, in my view. This is the main thing that I want to really say. This is kind of really the point of this talk is if you take nothing else away from what I'm saying, read this book by Doris Ruch, Making Deep Games. So I mentioned that article by Ian Bogost was the sort of first time I encountered what I thought was a really great articulation of this style of game that I knew I loved, but that I hadn't been able to describe. This book is like the next evolution of that. This is an incredibly well-written, deep look at these types of games, and you'll get a lot more out of it than you will from this micro talk. So definitely read this book. So I just want to end by showing one other game that I made, which again, so you'll see visually, it's has a lot of similarities with Glass Ceiling. This is a game called Hurdles. I wanted to show this one along with Glass Ceiling. So Glass Ceiling obviously was a fairly political game. This is, I feel, my most personal game that I've ever made. It relates to kind of personal experiences with anxiety and feeling overwhelmed, and kind of trying to maintain control over things and so on. So I'll show you quickly Hurdles. So I'll just describe the rules as I go along. So the basic idea is there are these little like runners, and there are these hurdles. When a runner encounters a hurdle, it tries to jump it, but it can only jump the smallest one initially. So I need to click to drop the hurdle down. But every time I click, it's going to also create a new instance. And they can get stuck if they can't clear the hurdle. If they get to the left edge, then that kind of runner will lose, die off. Sometimes you need to click quite a few times in order to drop the hurdle down enough. So they start off in this blue state, and they can only jump the smallest hurdles, the blue ones. As they manage to clear hurdles, they sort of level up, if you like, a bit. So this one has leveled up to the next level, so it can clear the next highest height. This one, if I help it out, will get there. So eventually they get to the point where they can clear 3 out of 4 of them. So, and there's points. If you're into that sort of thing, you get a point every time that one of your runners clears a hurdle. So that's basically it for this game. And I was really happy with it for a number of reasons. One of which was I just felt like it really encapsulated not only like my understanding, my experience of anxiety on some level, but like the feeling of it. So Doris Ruch talks in her book when she's talking about sort of metaphors in games about how you can sort of design a game in order to simulate the way you think something actually works. I guess the more objective approach, if you like. Or, alternatively, you can try to depict how it feels, right? A more expressionistic way of presenting whatever your game represents. And this to me is a bit of both, but it's definitely more on the expressionistic side. And those sorts of expressive systems are the things that I'm really most interested in and fascinated by as a designer. And so, the last reason that this is kind of the game that I've made that I'm the happiest with is watching people play it, the sort of experience that they go through. So there's sort of like this 10,000 feet view of like, okay, I get it. I see what the rules represent, what have you. The experience of playing it that I've watched most people have is they play it kind of like whack-a-mole initially because they're figuring out what to do. So initially, this is kind of what they'll do. Bit like this. And that's a good way to lose really quickly in this, even if you're actually generally trying. I'm not gonna be able to do it. So, the people that have played this game the longest and I guess achieved the highest scores from what I've seen, they kind of, through playing, eventually get to this point where they have like a bit of a eureka moment where they eventually realize like, okay, I should focus on maybe a few of these, as many as I can handle. I should get them to a point where they're reasonably self-sufficient as much as they can be. And in the first build of this game, actually the person who played it the longest, who got the highest score that I'm aware of, they sort of trained a bunch of these red ones, like a whole line of them, and then they went out to lunch and left the game running. And when they came back, they had quite a high score. And that's actually, to me, that was like perfect. That was just a beautiful moment. So I've had people compare the experience of playing this to raising children, to teaching, to coaching sports teams. I guess that's a fairly obvious mapping. So anyway, these sorts of metaphorical games can really, people can relate it to lots of different experiences. If you make it sort of a metaphor that's versatile enough. So anyway. So these types of techniques can be used to make very personal, expressionistic things about how you feel about something or how it emotionally affects you. They can be used for making political games that kind of comment on some very specific real-world thing. And they really are quite versatile. So I would encourage all of you to try making games like this, read some of the things that I suggested, and that's everything that I had. So thank you very much. Questions?
What are some good game developers that we should totally follow, including you?
Thanks for asking, Taro. So, yeah, there's I'm Dream Logician, if you want to play more of my games that are like this. Not all of my games are like this, but it's a style that I like. So we did a episode of our game club a while back, where I was the host. And for those who don't know, Game Club is our monthly book club kind of discussion where we get together and talk about games. And when you host, you get to select the games. And so I was ridiculous, and I chose all of these games. That's actually where this image comes from, these were all the games I chose. And I did that because they're mostly 5-minute experiences. So people played, as many of them as they wanted to. So these are some of my favorites inherently, right? So I mentioned a few already, right? The Marriage by Rod Humble. If you want to get a sense of where a lot of these ideas started to gain a foothold among game developers, that is, I think where a lot of this started. If you're talking about the proceduralist style as a movement, that really is the forerunner. If you play the marriage, I suggest playing the divorce, which is a kind of critique game by another developer, Petri Puro, who made Crayon Physics, among other things. The divorce, I'll spoil it for you. If you don't want it spoiled, then you can plug your ears at this point. So the marriage is a very abstract game using just kind of some squares and different colored geometric shapes that was made by Rod Humble to express Rod Humble's experience or ideas about marriage, informed by his own marriage, presumably. The divorce is Pong. It was posted by Petri Puro on April Fool's Day. It's Pong with a very long explanation about what it represents to Petri Puro, about how it's his experience of being a child of divorce, supposedly, and the ball is like him being passed from parent to parent, and the parents are the paddles. So it's just, the critique, I suppose, being like, oh, you can graft anything onto these things. They're so abstract. I don't think that that's true. I don't know that Petri Puro really believes that's true. It was a very tongue-in-cheek thing. Rod Humble commented saying he loved it. Like, it was very friendly back and forth. But those are both worth checking out. Limb is by Merritt Kopis, who's just an incredible game designer. Definitely check out Limb, but like all of Merritt's games, amazing. Jason Rohrer, as I mentioned. Dysphoria is a game by Anna Anthropy about the experience of going through gender transition. A lot of these kind of border on, like, some of them are very abstract. Some of them are more just like short vignettes that still have very like representational character art, things like that. So Dysphoria is kind of somewhere in between. The two games in the lower left there, How Do You Do It and A Pretty Ornament I Made, are by Nina Freeman. Nina Freeman makes incredible like short vignette games about personal experiences. The Little Moon one is I Wish I Were the Moon. Today I Die is next to it. Those are both by Daniel Ben-Mergui. Apologies if I mispronounced that. They're very sort of like poetic games. I really like them. Crystal Warrior Kesha may not fit in this. I snuck that in there for Game Club. Parable of the Polygons is getting more towards like a very specific, it's more prose-like, I guess, in some ways, but it's still, simulation and metaphor have a really interesting relationship. When you simulate something, you're choosing what aspects of that thing to highlight, right? You can't actually reproduce the thing in full, or it wouldn't be a simulation anymore. So you're kind of choosing what things are important about something when you simulate it. Hence why like simulation and game creation are inherently political. You're choosing what you think is important. And I would argue, and I think in books like Metaphors We Live By, it is argued that metaphor does the same thing. When you understand a concept in terms of another thing, you're not, like, you're using that as a helpful shortcut. You're grafting a bunch of, like, time is money, right? Time isn't really money. And all the things that you can do with money, you can't necessarily do with time. But it's a useful construct because, like, a lot of the things map. Right, that's where it becomes like a fitting metaphor. But the metaphors you choose have a similar effect as a simulation does, in that they highlight certain aspects of the concept you're trying to understand, and they hide others. So choosing an apt metaphor is very similar to designing a good simulation. And Parable of the, I mention all of that only because I think Parable of the Polygons is a very good example of, if you play it, think about, what they put in the simulation, what they left out, and whether or not you agree with it. Right. What's missing.
I think Nicky Case also made made another very similar to Parable of Polygons, which is like a paper/simulation called Game of Trust.
Yeah. So Nicky Case has a site called Explorables. Makes these things called explorable explanations. Explorable explanations, which are all worth checking out. I didn't mention my Crystal Warrior Kesha's by Porpentine. Play all of Porpentine's games as well. So those are my suggestions.
Would you recommend Molly Industra as well?
I have shameful admission, I haven't played a lot of Molly Industria games.
Okay.
It's a kind of a blind spot for me.
Because I felt like How to Build a Better Mousetrap sounds like a lot like a game that you'd like.
Yeah.